Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into a concept that our modern world is, well, frankly, obsessed with: leadership.
It really is everywhere, isn't it?
It is. And if you just look around, our culture overwhelmingly prizes the impressive resume. The
Mm,
corner office, the kind of polished charisma that just naturally draws a crowd.
right.
We define influence almost exclusively by titles and visible positions of power, but we've collected a stack of sources that suggest that whole equation is fundamentally upside down.
Hmm.
What if true transformative influence is already happening in your life, at home, at work, in your community, completely regardless of the title on your door?
And that tension is exactly what we're here to unpack. This whole deep dive is about leadership beyond position.
Yeah.
The material we're drawing from, it insists on this really profound, almost countercultural shift. Our core mission is to pull out the transformative principles of influence by just changing the fundamental question we ask ourselves.
Okay, so what's the shift?
It's moving away from the external focus of what position do I hold, and moving toward the internal and, frankly, far more urgent question: what kind of person am I becoming?
And the sources? They waste no time. They jump right in. They immediately introduce what they call a crisis point.
They do.
They argue that communities, organizations, even nations falter, not because there's a shortage of talent or brilliant strategists or intelligence. We have those in abundance.
We do. But they falter because there's a scarcity of leaders who have the character and the depth to steward that influence with wisdom and integrity, especially when the pressure hits.
So it's a crisis of depth.
A crisis of depth, pure and simple. We routinely mistake leadership for visibility or, for control. We promote the most confident communicators. But what the sources warn is that if a person has authority but little inner depth, that leadership structure is just inherently fragile.
So it can't last.
It can't sustain itself, not when real pressure or ethical ambiguity or just failure arrives.
That makes perfect sense. So you're saying the cracks don't show up in the quarterly report necessarily, but in the character of the person signing that report. Okay, so let's unpack this. The first major foundation the sources insist on is this idea of becoming before leading.
Yes, the crucial reversal.
It's a huge reversal. I mean, we all agree that skills, strategy, experience, that stuff matters. But the argument here is that without serious personal formation, all those external talents, they eventually just collapse under the weight of responsibility.
And that's where the deep analysis of failure comes in. When you look at leadership failures, whether it's a public scandal, an ethical lapse, or even just burnout, they are rarely, at their root, a technical or a strategic mistake.
They're almost always what?
They're almost always character failures. Outer performance without inner integrity is a seductive trap.
A trap how?
Because it lets us produce short-term results, right? It lets us gather accolades. But it is fundamentally fragile when trials or genuine ethical dilemmas come along. It's a house built on sand.
I often hear people talk about a leader who has lost their way or gone off the rails. Is the source material suggesting they were maybe never on the rails in the first place? That the issues were always just latent?
Precisely. They were just masked by success. I mean, think about the classic warning sign we see in the sources. The story of King Saul.
Okay.
Here was a man with tactical brilliance. He won battles. He founded a kingdom. But his personal life was just a mess of spiraling insecurity, impulsivity, and envy toward anyone who threatened his position.
And the warning is?
The warning is that tactical victories cannot compensate for that inner instability. If you only address performance, you're just repainting a wall that has serious structural cracks underneath.
You look good for a while.
You'll look intact for a while, but the collapse is inevitable because the leader's unresolved personal insecurity becomes the ceiling of the entire organization.
Wow. That's a powerful takeaway for anyone listening. The collapse of your organization or your family will almost always track back to your own unresolved personal defects, no matter how brilliant you are tactically.
Absolutely. So this begs the question, right? Where does this essential formation happen?
Right.
It doesn't happen in the seminar room or the board meeting. The sources stress that it occurs in what they call the unseen spaces. It's in private disciplines, in daily faithfulness, and in how you choose to respond to deep pressure or disappointment or criticism.
That completely reframes the whole concept of leadership training. We assume training is about acquiring knowledge. Here it's about cultivating wisdom and fidelity.
It is, and the practical insight here is profound. Leadership doesn't begin the day you are promoted. It begins today in the daily choices you make,
Especially when no one's watching.
particularly when no recognition is at stake. The sources present this concept so beautifully through historical figures.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see this pattern in leadership prep called ROI of obscurity.
The ROI of obscurity, I
Yeah.
like that.
Moses spent 40 years on the backside of the wilderness just caring for sheep before confronting Pharaoh. That was his training ground for patience, for humility.
Right.
David wasn't recognized when he was learning courage and responsibility in fields and caves. And even the ultimate example of leadership spent decades unseen before beginning any public work.
So the universal lesson here, it seems, regardless of your belief system, is clear. We need to stop chasing external validation and start cultivating competence in places where no one can validate us. Because if the foundation of your character can't handle obscurity, it will certainly fail under the spotlight.
It's the preparation that counts.
That gives us a great bridge to section 2 then. Service, proximity, and what the sources call the relational imperative. So if the inner life is formed in those unseen spaces, how does that character actually show up externally? Especially when we talk about what defines success.
Well, this is where the sources argue that Christ-like leadership radically redefines success. It rejects positional dominance completely.
It just throws it out.
It flips the script entirely. The source principle is that greatness is measured by service, faithfulness, and courage, not by visibility or net worth or control. It's an evaluation of quality over quantity.
And when you look at history through that particular lens, you realize that some of the most impactful leaders often look like these really countercultural figures.
Exactly. Look at William Wilberforce. His leadership was marked by decades of just relentless perseverance and humility, laboring against the entrenched interests of the slave trade. His victory wasn't charismatic. It was grinding, faithful service.
Right.
Then you contrast him with someone like Mother Teresa. She had no formal political authority, no massive corporate structure, but her relentless focus on saving the poorest of the poor gave her a global influence because she redefined success by proximity and humility.
Proximity. That's fascinating because the sources really discuss the power of proximity. We often associate authority with distance, right? The CEO is on the top floor, unreachable, protected.
Layers of assistance.
Exactly. But the analysis here points out that sustainable influence grows not from distance, but from being near.
The deepest form of influence isn't done from a stage. It's done elbow to elbow. I mean, if we look at the core leadership model presented in the sources, it was incredibly relational. The model leader spent more time walking with, forming relationships with, and just eating meals with his team than he ever did delivering grand sermons to the masses.
Influence through nearness.
That's the radical principle. Transformation happens through shared life, not just mass instruction.
And that's a huge challenge for modern leadership, which is so often optimized for efficiency and for scale. We want to reach the most people with the least amount of personal investment. But you're saying the inverse is true for real transformation.
We've confused information transmission with relational transformation. Information scales, relationships, they don't. And that deep relational aspect ties into one of my favorite figures the sources highlight, Barnabas, the son of encouragement.
I found the story of Barnabas so counterintuitive. Because we usually celebrate Paul, the one who launches the missions and writes the letters. But Barnabas's influence was all about supporting someone else's success.
He perfectly exemplifies this relational imperative of sponsorship. He vouches for Paul when everyone else doubts him, bridging that gap of trust. And he models the kind of leader who doesn't define John Mark by his failure.
Right, when he gives up.
When John Mark gives up mid-mission, Barnabas prioritizes restoration and mentorship over mission efficiency, and that leads to an eventual critical partnership. Influence truly multiplies when leaders refuse to hoard power and instead use their authority to create space for others to grow.
Even if it costs them.
Even if that means the leader, Barnabas in this case, steps out of the spotlight and it costs him personal recognition.
It's the difference between a boss who only sees the bottom line and a mentor who sees the potential in the human being, even if they've just failed.
Exactly. And this relational emphasis, it extends crucially to the leader's own sustainability.
Yeah.
Leaders are so vulnerable to burnout when isolation and pressure and expectation all converge.
Well, yeah.
The sources bring up Elijah's experience. After achieving this massive public triumph, He immediately fled into the wilderness in despair. He felt alone, exhausted.
That's the risk of a massive win. You feel untouchable, and then the crash just inevitably comes. So what did the ultimate authority do? Did he give him a new strategy?
No, God's response was not reproach or a new sermon outline or a new strategic direction. It was nourishment, rest, and gentle encouragement.
Sounds simple.
He was told to eat, sleep, and take a long restorative walk. Sustainable leadership requires clear rhythms of rest, self-examination, and solitude. The sources emphasize Sabbath and quiet reflection to resist the idol of performance and busyness that leads to isolation and eventually self-deception.
Okay, so if we've covered the inner life and the relational life, let's shift gears to the external challenges. Section 3, obedience, courage, and hope. I mentioned earlier that modern leadership rewards predictability. The sources call this tendency paralysis masked as prudence, because decisions get delayed, risks are avoided, and organizations just start to drift, not from recklessness, but from inaction rooted in the leader's fear.
And this raises that critical distinction. What is the difference between an effective manager and a genuine history shaper?
Okay.
It's the willingness to move when clarity is partial. Managers wait for the map to be complete. True leaders move with only a promise.
But we're trained to demand data. We demand comprehensive risk assessment before we move an inch.
And that leads to stasis. The biblical pattern is built on trusting God without having the full map. Abraham was called to leave his homeland without knowing exactly where he was going. He relied only on a promise. His hope did not wait for certainty or perfect clarity. It generated movement. That's the principle. Obedience precedes clarity. You take the next step, and the path only illuminates as you walk it.
That demands a kind of courage that modern leadership often lacks because we prioritize control over trust.
And that brings us to the famous Peter test. Peter, stepping out of the boat, illustrates faith-driven courage. He acted based on a clear invitation and trust in the source of that invitation.
Okay.
But we have to contrast that sharply with presumption, which substitutes human impulse or desire for God's explicit purposes.
What's an example of that?
Well, we see presumption in the story of Uzzah touching the ark. He acted impulsively, presuming his protection and his good intentions were enough to violate a very clear boundary.
I see.
So in a corporate parallel, Peter's move is the ethical risk, the willingness to step out for a deeply held value when the outcome is uncertain. Uzzah's move is the impulsive decision made purely for ego, cutting corners and presuming protection from consequences because he feels he's essential or entitled.
So true courage is grounded in fidelity and trust, not self-reliance or arrogance.
Precisely.
That differentiation is crucial. Courage is acting in line with your integrity. Presumption is acting outside of it. So how does this type of courage interact with the concept of hope, especially in a time of instability?
We really need to clarify the nature of hope-led leadership. Hope is so often confused with just optimism. Optimism denies suffering. It says, the market will rebound next quarter, so don't worry.
Right, the it'll all be fine approach.
Actually, but theological certainty, which is what the sources define hope as, is different. Hope doesn't say everything will be fine. Hope says God is faithful even if everything is not.
And that difference is vital for a leader.
It's everything. Hope ensures that you can maintain emotional and moral presence during times of scarcity or crisis or collapse. While others withdraw or panic or compromise, the hope-led leader models stability and integrity because their foundation isn't the market or the quarterly results. It's the fidelity of a deeper promise.
And finally, we return to the devastating cost of just doing nothing. The parable of the talents makes this crystal clear. The servant who buried his talent framed his decision entirely in fear. He said, I knew you to be a hard man, so I was afraid. This still faith prioritizes preservation above all else and waits for perfect assurance.
Exactly. And it's the leader who is so afraid of failing that they allow the organization to drift into irrelevance. They fear the risk more than the stagnation. But the narrative champions living faith, which prioritizes obedience and acts on trust, accepting that there is no guarantee of perfect outcomes, only the surety of the relationship.
So inaction rooted in fear.
It's judged more harshly than failure rooted in obedience.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? I mean, we've completely redefined leadership here. We've moved it away from focusing on title and performance, and we've centered it on character and service. The ultimate synthesis of these sources suggests the future belongs not to the loudest or the most visible leaders, but to the most faithful.
The ones who cultivate that depth.
The ones who cultivate depth and integrity in unseen places, long before they ever step into the spotlight.
And that is the ultimate takeaway. The lasting measure of influence isn't the number of accolades you collect, the size of your organization, or your reach on social media. The metric of true leadership is transformation.
Transformation.
Yeah, how deeply the people around you are formed, and the growth and flourishing of those you lead. Influence flows entirely from character, service, and faithful obedience.
That leaves us with a provocative thought, something for you to reflect on this week. We invite you to consider your immediate spheres of influence, your home, your workplace, your community. What small daily act of faithfulness, integrity, or courage could you commit to this week that aligns with service, even if absolutely no one notices, that would fundamentally change your leadership legacy? We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.